Welcome once again. My name is Serge Borso, and this is Beyond the Basics, what Cloud Defenders needs to know. Also, another working title here, which is to build a resilient defense. What we're going to talk about in this webinar are going to be a few different things. I'll talk about gaining visibility across various CSPs, that's cloud service providers, and the reason why that matters. When I say gaining visibility, I'll go way more in depth when we get to that topic, but I'm talking about being able to see the actual attacks that are occurring, or the anomalies, or the maliciousness, or just basic business functions and operations from an application and control plane perspective inside of your cloud environment, and why that matters, like the whole why behind this, and then a little bit of a what, a little bit of a how, a little bit of all of the above. Beyond that, we'll talk about identity and access management, IAM, because you can't really have a thorough, high-quality cloud conversation pertaining to security, in my opinion, without going into some level of depth with IAM. We'll also talk about one of the more important pieces of the puzzle, putting everything together with the services that you have in place, your team, your CI/CD pipeline, your security posture, goals, your architecture. Like, the big thing here is automation. You may have a lot of tools in place already. You may have a lot of structure. You may have this great policy. You may have a lot of security programs and security champions. But if you're not automating a large portion of what it is that you do from a security perspective, you're probably falling short. And we're going to talk about that, of course. Also talk about some cloud native tools that we can leverage to help enhance our security posture, and then just understanding how to manage risk effectively. Now, the first thing here to actually, just go back to slide, build a resilient defense, what you as an enterprise defender needs to know. And before I go any further, I'm going to try to make this clear. I, as someone who's been doing this for about 20 plus years, will tell you, I look at this from an enterprise perspective, and maybe that's a little bit of a cliche after saying it for so many years, but I'm talking how larger organizations deal with enterprise security, enterprise cloud security. That's really the main thing here, like doing these things at scale. These things like the first one, the strategy of how to enhance your security posture, unified visibility. And I'm just purely jumping right into it. Okay, so what you see here are things like aggregating logs, asset inventory, and then normalization. And why these things actually matter, which is, like I said, one of the more important pieces to all of this, is the why. And actually, before I even get into more on that, I want to say something different. The reality here, the multi-cloud reality. All right, so when you're operating in the cloud, and I'm talking GCP, I'm talking AWS, I'm talking Azure, you name it. The three big CSPs, of course, are the ones I just mentioned, but a lot of us have some type of footprint in the cloud. And this could be infrastructure as a service, which is probably more the direction I'm going to focus on during this talk, but it could also be platform as a service or software as a service. A lot of us are, or all of us really, are in the cloud to one extent or another. The reality is that a lot of us are in multi-cloud. And actually, as you're trying to, quote unquote, defend the enterprise, and you're in charge of cloud security as an engineer or an analyst or whatever your title happens to be, the reality comes down to the fact that you can't just have one strategy that's going to work across every single CSP. At a high level, sure, you can look to NIST 853, or you can look to some methodology or framework, like others that would be relevant depending on what industry you're operating in, and that'll give you a good blueprint, if you will. But where the rubber meets the road, for lack of better words, like as in where you actually have to start implementing security controls across different cloud providers, that's where it starts getting a bit more challenging. New complex security challenges. Like, if I have to deal with IAM, as in I have a number of people on the team that need to log in and perform functions in multi-cloud environments, where do they log into? Are they logging into their GCP account, and then they're logging into their Azure account with Entra ID, and they're logging into AWS? Like, where's the identity management system reside at? Have you gotten to the point where you've coalesced and consolidated all of those different IAM activities into one centralized location, like you're using Okta and federated identity, and that's your solution. The answer is no, we log into 3 different places, and that's the way it's always been. Okay, you're not alone, if that makes you feel better, but you're also not doing, there's room for improvement, let me put it that way. And that's kind of the reality here. It's not just like there's one right way to go about implementing security controls in the quote unquote cloud, because it's not one cloud, it's not one set of services, it's not whatever. It's more complex and challenging. And that's kind of the reality here. Shared responsibility. All right, there's an assumption. There's an assumption that our cloud service providers are going to be taking care of the basics of security, in the cloud. Pretty well known, understood. The CSP has some responsibility to maintaining security of what they control and what they provide to us as services and products, as well as availability, uptime, things like that. Beyond what the CSP provides to us, now we're talking about utilizing those services, and that's where security in the cloud versus out the cloud actually comes into this, where we as a customer, we deploy given resources in our environment. We're then responsible for, of course, securing all those different resources. And the reality is that this model does become fragmented, where it's not always obvious, depending on which CSP you're using and your level of expertise in that provider, of where that line of delineation actually is. So I'll probably sprinkle a little bit of that in there as we get into it, but it gets much, much deeper than just, where does one person's responsibility end and mine pick up, because there's a little bit of a gray area depending on what it is we're talking about. Now, the challenge here also, as I alluded to at the beginning of the introduction, is this reality of fragmented visibility. And what I mean when I say this is that, and I think anybody here who has a cloud defender title, whatever that title for your position happens to be, like if you're in charge of helping secure your organization and you're actively working in a cloud provider's environment, then you're probably aware that it's not one single pane of glass that you go to. It's not one dashboard. It's not one tool. It's not one, oh, we bought whatever tool it happens to be, and this is where I go. I log in every day. Maybe if you're a SOC analyst and that's like your very narrow focus, and you log in, you look at Splunk all day, okay, cool. But people who are doing this at a greater scale realize you're looking at 5, 10, 15 different tools sometimes and different dashboards. And it's cumbersome. It's not effective. What you want to do ideally is get your visibility into one location. And now that's a pretty vague statement. Like, what does that actually mean? Get your visibility to one location. What I'm referring to here is trying to solve these problems here. You lack a single unified view of all your assets, and that's, number one critical security control, understanding what assets you even have to begin with. And of course, in a cloud environment, the ephemeral nature of spinning up machines and containers, and then they disappear a few seconds later or minutes later, as the case may be, it's a little bit different type of challenge. But at the end of the day, you have to start somewhere, and that's understanding what assets you have. As an enterprise defender, as a cloud defender, it's the same concept. I need to know what we have in our environment in order for me to be able to protect it. Okay. Now, not just dealing with assets and inventory, which is really what it comes down to, but also having security controls built into your environment and architected cloud natively, ideally, such that you have the visibility into when suspicious activity is occurring. Threat detection, for example, or if you have blind spots, or if you have, like I said before, IAM that's disparate. You log into 3 different providers, you don't have aggregation of those logs, so you're not being notified in real time, or maybe even at all, if there's suspicious activity of a service account, or an IAM account, or a application, machine-to-machine account, like whatever it happens to be. All right, and that's oftentimes where bad things begin to happen, when you have the lack of visibility. We also have other challenges here. What we have in this slide is inconsistent posture. Different platforms do have different ways that they can be configured. As in, it's not, to this day, feasible for you to have one template, one set of instructions, just one mechanism by which you can deploy all resources across all of your infrastructure with a high level of fidelity and a high level of confidence that what you've deployed is not just running successfully, but tuned to the point where you have visibility once again across all those different platforms. All right, that you can write code once infrastructure is code, you can deploy to multiple cloud service providers, but actually having confidence that, okay, if and when we're being attacked in Kubernetes or in this container, or there's a some type of SBOM issue where we have some third-party dependency that has a CVSS score of 7.8 and it's actively being exploited in this application stack over here. Like, what's your level of confidence that you'd know about that? What's your level of confidence that your CI/CD pipeline would prevent that code from going live? What's your level of confidence that if someone was launching an attack right now, you would see it, not just block it, but you'd have the visibility into it? And it gets pretty deep pretty quick because it's not just we're deploying resources to each CSP, but it's also, okay, those resources are now running, people are using them, end users are interacting with our endpoints and APIs, and we're being attacked constantly. It's not just like an Nmap or Nessus scan. It's like we have nation states, we have people who are very motivated with a lot of time on their hands, and they're able to actively attack our applications and endpoints in a way that may not be obvious to the tools that we have in place, like bypassing a web application firewall, or maybe you have an endpoint that doesn't have any EDR installed on it, or whatever it happens to be. The point here is that we do have, generally speaking, inconsistent posture. And this comes down to maybe we have a lot of expertise in AWS, and we're an AWS shop. And then, 6 months ago, you went through merger acquisition, as the case may be, you acquired a company, and that company is an Azure shop, a bunch of Microsoft folks, or, people who use Microsoft as their go-to cloud service provider of choice. And you're trying to now merge that other company's technology stack into your own, and you don't have a lot of the Azure expertise. And it's like, well, hopefully you have some human resources from those other companies or that company that you acquired that has the expertise. But I could switch out the names of cloud providers with services or tools or you name it. It's like, yeah, we bought this tool, but we didn't really implement it all the way, or we didn't really get the right training, or we still don't know how to use it, or it's one of 15 tools and we don't really have time to look at it. Or those of you who do this day in and day out and are dealing with these type of issues know exactly what I'm talking about. And those of you who don't, this is reality. You have budget, you buy tools, you implement those tools, and sometimes you look at them, sometimes they're not tuned very well. And this all results in what you see exactly here on the slide, an inconsistent posture, where you have maybe a affordable defense as pertains to your endpoints, an affordable defensive posture pertaining to your endpoints, APIs, web app, OWASP top 10 type of things. And the reality is that maybe you're lacking visibility inside the management plane. You have some CloudTrail set up, but they're not going into a SIEM. They're not feeding into any detective tool to alert you for suspicious behavior. Yeah, that's pretty much normal. So let's talk about what do you actually do about it. And this is where you talk about unified visibility. So the first thing is aggregation of logs. These ideas that I'm about to go into, each one of these strategies I'm about to talk about, does require prerequisites, is probably the best way to say it. So when I talk about aggregating logs and centralizing all your different logs from each one of your CSPs into a data lake or a security information event management tool, like I said, Splunk before, maybe you have QRadar or you have Sentinel or you have whatever it is, right? Well, that's a question unto itself. Which SIEM are you choosing to use? Using Graylog, sticking with the open source route, or are you paying for some licenses for that? Or maybe you're spending, maybe you have budget for something bigger like Splunk, right? And now it's like, okay, cool, we got the tool. Now let's go ahead and centralize all these logs. Well, how do you do that? Like, let me take a step back. Why? Why do it? Why do we care? Why is this important? Why is this quote unquote unified visibility topic even important? And the answer to that question is because you can't usually stop or defend against attacks that you can't see. Now, there's some default built-in security to a lot of different tools and services and applications and so on and so forth. Like you deploy an application and you went through a secure build process, you don't have any SQL injection vulnerability. Awesome, cool. but that doesn't mean you have visibility into when you're being attacked. It doesn't mean you have visibility into when someone does actively try to launch a server-side request forgery vulnerability and you don't have a web application firewall in place. Just as an example, right? It could be more API-centric, it could be more infrastructure-centric, it could be more insider threat-centric, you name it. The point is, without visibility into suspicious activities, or any activity, because any activity could end up being suspicious in the right context, you're lacking the ability to understand when you're being attacked, if you're being attacked, and when you get breached, you want to be able to have some type of means by which you can go back and connect the dots to figure out what actually happened, understand the root cause analysis, or understand the root cause so you can analyze that, and then go from there. So this is why it actually matters. Not saying it's easy to do. Don't misunderstand me. But yeah. Just a reminder, please feel free to send any questions that you have, and I'll do my best to answer those. Going back to asset inventory, this is really what it comes down to. You're not going to have, okay, so logs. What's a log? I'm not going to go into what's a log, depending on what your job happens to be. I'm sure you know what a log actually is. Now, generation of logs matters. This is a different topic, as in your applications generate logs, your management plane, control plane generates logs, as in someone logs into AWS or Azure or GCP, there's a log of that. We know the date, we have a timestamp, we know the user ID, we know the source IP address, we know the user agent, we know the source, we know the destination, we know the geolocation, we know the level of permission sets, we know all the different policies that were applied to this user, we know all of those things just built in by default, period. Whether you're using a third-party tool that handles your federated identity for you, or using the cloud provider's built-in IAM solution. All those logs are, generally speaking, by default, they already exist. Same thing for endpoints. You have a Windows box, you have Linux boxes, you have a container that you've built. Generally speaking, you have logs that are being generated on the endpoint as someone makes a request to the service running on that endpoint. What else? S3 logs, API calls. Anytime there's an API call inside of any one of our CSPs, like someone read content from this resource, or someone made a change to a firewall rule, or someone added a user, or whatever it is, all those result in API calls that are by default logged for us. Default, as in they exist without us having to go through a lot of effort to manually create that. Now, of course, longevity matters, storage matters, data classification matters. That's a different topic. Perhaps we'll get into later. But the point is, you have logs. Now you want to put them somewhere. And of course, hand in hand with asset inventory, having all those different assets that are live inside of your environment, pointing their logs to a central repository. That's really what we're getting to. Then normalization, having high quality, useful information being sent in those logs. Oftentimes not a huge hurdle, but sometimes you have some custom applications or some weirdness that you just don't know about until you delve into it and realize, oh, these assets, this class of assets or resources haven't been logging, and now that they are, the logs are in a weird format or not conveying useful information, or we have a router and it's set to debug mode, and we don't need that level of detailed information being sent pretty much ever unless you're trying to debug it. But it actually matters. All this kind of comes into play to do something for our security posture. Now, when I say achieving a unified view, which is what you're looking at right here, what I'm talking about is contextualizing those threats. What does that actually mean? It means we're talking about correlation of data. We don't want to put ourselves in the position where we turn on a bunch of logs that maybe weren't turned on by default. And this is where it gets a little more interesting, all right? Because we're talking about operating within our cloud providers environment, like using GCP resources, using Azure, using our, the cloud native services. There are default logs that are turned on. I've already established that. But there are a number of logs or logging options, perhaps I should say, that are not turned on by default. Like if you want to have query level logging in RDS, is that a thing? Yeah. Is it turned on by default? No. Does it matter? You tell me. When someone executes a query, do you need to know about that? And here's the next kind of topic here where this kind of naturally gravitates towards. Maybe we don't want to know about it, but we want to have it logged. Probably. This is where I can stand here and talk about this, but you actually got to think about it yourself and realize that you have probably a lot of services, a lot of users, a lot of resources, a lot of whatever. Are you actually getting quality logs generated on those things? And then are you getting them sent to a unified location? All right. I'm not saying alert on all these things. Not at all. I'm saying have a basis by which you at least have the information so you can do something with it later on. And it's not you as a human, which is more and more true every day. It's you as a company, you as a team, you as a security team that is using a set of tools that aggregates these logs for us, which is what I've been referring to, like the SIMs that I mentioned before. You have a SIM, all of your logs go there. That SIM ideally is, for lack of better words, intelligent enough to know when something suspicious is occurring. We're trying to reduce alert fatigue at the end of the day. I'm not saying alert on everything. I'm saying we be smart about this, use your tools, and then of course the name of the game here is tuning your tools to actually get useful alerts. And as you can see here, as I also mentioned before, if you're getting into any type of breach or incident response situation, you need to have those logs by default living somewhere so you can do something with it. All right, I will stop talking for a moment and ask if anybody has any questions so far. All right, cool. If you do, go ahead and ask them. The next strategy beyond the first strategy, and the first strategy, of course, we're talking about unified visibility. This is where it all kind of starts from, having visibility into what's going on. The next strategy is centralized identity access management. Okay, and this is where it gets, in my opinion, pretty challenging pretty quick because, well, let me back up once again. Why? Why do we care? Why is this important? Why is this strategy even being talked about? What's the importance of identity and access management? What I mean when I say IAM is anything that like users. You have users, you have groups, you have roles, you have permissions, you have authentication, authorization, you have someone logging in, you're enforcing two-factor authentication, you have adequate logging, you have account reset processes, you have break glass accounts. This is all directly or very close to tangentially identity and access management. It's usually a team of people, depending how big your company is. Maybe it's just you who's dealing with identity and access management day in, day out, as in controlling access into the environment and oftentimes within the environment. Okay. And it's not just humans and end users. It's also, as I alluded to before, things like service accounts or machine to machine identities, identity pools, if you're using whatever services you may be using in each one of your CSPs, like Cognito, for example, inside of AWS. What we're talking about here with centralized IAM is solving for the problem of disparate accounts, disparate permission sets, lack of parity across the organization, the spectrum of services that you're consuming as a company. And that's maybe a fancy way of saying what I've said before. You're multi-cloud, you have a bunch of different services, you have maybe a bunch of different things you log into on a regular basis. I certainly know that I do, whether it's a VPN or your zero trust solution or your mail, and of course your Active Directory account, your cloud accounts, your application, whatever it is. There's probably, those are 8 legitimate logins you probably do almost every day of your life. Unless, of course, you have centralized this and you have some single sign-on where you log in once and you have access to everything you have access to. Yeah, right. It's like 2025, 2026. I'm still waiting for that to happen. Maybe one day. I still have password vaults with hundreds of different sets of credentials in there, and I'll leave it at that. Centralized IAM. What we're trying to accomplish here is implementing some federated identity providers, and this is where it goes. I mentioned the word Okta. It could be Ping. It could be Jump Cloud. It could be other service providers like that. Here in the U.S., those are pretty common service providers or solutions providers for centralized identity access management and federated identity. What we're really trying to get down to here is uh, multi. We're trying to solve multiple problems here. Like not just convenience, like balancing convenience and security, which is how much time do I have to talk? Not that much time. Okay, so I won't go down on a rabbit hole with that. But having a means by which end users, employees, if you will, in this case, can log in and do their job. And that's a really interesting topic if you actually think about what that means to have someone, an employee, log in and do their job. How many hoops are we making them jump through? How annoying and cumbersome is the process of them just turning on their machine and logging in and getting their job done? How much two-factor they have to go through? And depending on if you're working with GovCloud or you have super sensitive environments, clearly there's going to be a balance once again. But once again, single sign-on as you log in once and you have the ability to access the resources that you need to, with some type of ideally like zero trust solution implemented here as well, such that we're not just, oh, you logged in, you're an admin, you have admin rights to everything all the time. Like, well, we maybe want to challenge that user or force 2FA or whatever it happens to be at some point, depending on what operations are trying to perform at what given time from what IP address. Is this abnormal activity? Is this normal activity? Whatever it is. Like this all falls under the category of identity access management. And when I say centralizing it, it's like having one identity provider instead of 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever it is. Now, once again, the why this matters. This is important because if you don't have some type of centralized IAM identity provider solution, you end up with a situation where once again, you don't have parity, you don't have consistency across platforms. And maybe you don't have two-factor authentication turned on for VPNs, but you have two-factor authentication turned on for direct logins to Entra ID. Maybe you don't have adequate logging for your application authentication processes. But had you pushed everyone through a single identity provider, that identity provider would then be the solution that does give you that visibility into here's the user, here's the timestamp, all the stuff I mentioned before. All right. Without this, oftentimes, like I said before, you simply don't have the visibility you need to be successful with what you're trying to accomplish. Now, how do you actually go about doing this? You have a multitude of providers that you could choose to look into if you're not already using one of them. For other things, it goes a little bit deeper. It's not just, okay, we're gonna purchase a tool, go with this service provider, and then say we're good to go. Like, no. The vendor may tell you that, but that's not how it is in the real world. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending which way you look at it. The reality is that you need to start somewhere. Okay, and I've mentioned a few identity providers already. It may be worth having a conversation with a VAR or with these entities or within your own company first to figure out where your deficiencies lie at, and then what the effective strategy might be to actually put some controls in place around it. The second bullet point-ish that you see here is just-in-time access for privileged operations. And this is very cloud-centric and cloud-specific, where you may be performing some operation or an action or making a change within your environment that is abnormal. Like we have an emergency, or there's an outage, or we're doing instant response, or whatever it is. We're trying to stop the spread of malware. We're dealing with ransomware. We're have emergency requests to open a firewall rule, whatever it is. This is where, depending on like a case-by-case situation, you may have the ability to use just-in-time access. What that actually is where you request excessive privileges, like admin rights, for lack of better words, or the privilege to perform a function that is not normally performed. But there's an audit trail built into each one of our CSPs associated with that access. And there's approvals too. That's a huge point to all of this, where you have separation of duties and control over who's doing what. Then role-based access control, of course, that's a deeper conversation, but on the surface here, make sure you have the right permissions in place and are using temporary credentials. Hard-coded or long-lasting credentials are not the way to go. Keys, for example, static keys that never change. And this is a real thing. Like, I'm kind of trailing off here a little bit because I'm like, who still does this? But it still comes up. I did a penetration test just within the last 2 or 3 months, and we found some long-lived credentials that, okay, this has been rotated in 2 years. Like, why is this key still in use and still valid and hasn't been revoked, and it hasn't even been used. Like we found it, but it's not actively in use yet. It grants excessive permissions to anybody who holds that key. And then, of course, the last thing here is uh, this company I just mentioned a moment ago, they chose to do penetration test. And we identified that example with many other examples of here's some things you could be doing better to avoid, potentially bad circumstances occurring. Why I mention that is because having some type of audit or checks in place to validate that the controls that you have are actually working is critically important. You may have a tool, you may have a service provider, you may have whatever, but if you're not actually going back and saying, is this set up properly? Do we have any deficiencies? Did we forget to do something? Or, having a separate set of eyes sometimes goes a long way in actually understanding where deficiencies reside at. The next strategy here is automation. Okay. Automation, as in we as a human are not going to go through and do all the stuff we just talked about. Maybe we're setting it up. We're, of course, tuning it. We're, of course, validating it. We're hopefully hiring or using an internal entity to do penetration testing annually at least. Beyond that, we're talking about largely getting to the point where we can automate a lot of the tasks so we don't actually have to manually do any of this. One such tool that helps with that would be a cloud security posture management tool, a CSPM. And what this can do and what it will do when you've implemented it, it's like a software, if you will. It's like a tool software that you give permissions inside of your cloud environments. As in, you create an account, you say this account has read-only access, and this account is now associated with this CSPM. Okay, cool. And now that allows the CSPM to essentially ascertain the configuration settings and way more of your cloud environments. As in, how well have you configured your S3 buckets? How well have you configured your security groups? How well have you configured your other cloud storage and databases and containers? How well have you configured IAM? Are you using a third-party identity provider? Are you enforcing two-factor authentication? Are you so on and so forth? The answers to those questions, I'm not saying go out and look yourself. I mean, ideally, yeah, that's cool, that's great, do it. But also automate it. Have a tool that's going to assist you with getting answers to those questions. Now, there's a big drawback here. There's drawbacks with a lot of the stuff I'm talking about. Like the last topic is centralizing IAM. Yeah, it's a great idea. Go ahead and do it. And check back in a year, see how far you've got. I'm not saying this stuff is easy, but the topic of this conversation wasn't how to easily make changes. It was, making important changes within in strategies for, beyond the basics. What cloud defenders need to know. You need to know this if you're in charge of defending your cloud infrastructure. Straight up. So how does the CSPM work? I just mentioned how it works, but the caveat here is you may be inundated with work, as in, oh, we deployed our CSPM and it's working beautifully and it's tuned and it has all the visibility it needs. And now we have like 756 different things we have to go work on now to fix because the CSPM came back, it assessed our environment, and we didn't do a very good job when we deployed. And there's a lot of things to fix. And where do we start? And that's a very real thing. Same thing with vulnerability scanning tools. Same thing with any type of automated security identification solution, for lack of better words. They all come back with, hey, we found a bunch of things. Okay, how many of these things are actually important? Where does it actually matter? And that's where that's on you to a large extent. Clearly, you want to focus on the higher or critical risk items that the CSPM comes back and identifies for you. But beyond that, it's maybe some easy wins. Maybe it's a conversation that's more challenging, like we need to do some developer training or secure code training for things like this, and ultimately do a culture shift, which is a brief aside I'll mention here for a moment. I was just speaking with a colleague in the last few days, and we were talking about how to change the direction of the company to actually not care about security, but they care about security. It's great. They seriously care about security. The whole organization cares about security to some extent. But it's like, how do we get these policies in place to where we're going to have secure code and we're going to have a secure build process and we're going to have like golden image utilization above 0%. So people actually use the containers, images, and so on and so forth that have been sanctioned by the security team and locked down and hardened and all this stuff. And he was asking me these questions. The answer I gave after I thought about it for a while, it got a little more clarity of what it's trying to accomplish, was like a slow culture shift. It's and we're talking like a Fortune 50 company where he works at. So it's a huge, multi-billion-dollar organization. You're not going to change it overnight. You're not going to buy a tool and implement it and things are just going to magically be good. Like it takes in my opinion, my experience, a slow culture shift that starts with you and what you're doing right now. Listening to this webinar and ideally going back to your place of business with ideas and some solutions and having a conversation about how things can get better. And then, of course, getting some security champions and folks to, take up the fight with you to make slow and steady changes over time. All right, back to posture automation in depth. All right, so CSPM findings, integration-wise. Automation being the main topic of conversation here, you're going to have tools, a CSPM being one of them. When your tools find vulnerabilities, you ultimately want to have some integration with other things, other processes that are already automated, like a CI/CD pipeline, or with, I was going to say vulnerability scanning, but maybe that's not quite the example I want to give here. The point is that as you are automating workflows, whatever those workflows happen to be, you have the ability to fix there's a better word for it, to fix the issues that keep on coming up, like foundationally change the way that your organization operates. And this is like one step at a time, as in you're deploying code. All right, someone's deploying, developers write code, they deploy the code, it goes to the CI/CD pipeline, and you have a running application that is now in production. Okay, cool. But there's a systemic issue with every single one of these build processes that we have an outdated version of this third-party library. Every single time we build, it's the same issue. Okay, that's a systemic issue. The CSPM comes back and it's like, this is still like a high risk on the CVE, on the CVE scoring system. It's a high risk. Why is it not being addressed? And that's where we want to go back and systemically say, hey, we need to use a different package. We need to update this package. We need to understand if this is even impacting code. Do we need to use this library? Is there an alternative? Or, just deal with it in another capacity if you need to. As in, I was going to say this, like mute the finding if it's not actionable, but that's a bigger conversation for a different time. Shift left, this isn't like a big application and AppSec conversation, but the concept with shifting left is integrating security sooner in the SDLC. So when you start talking about planning and having conversations with the stakeholders, and before you start even writing code, you already have a security mindset built into the program. That's what shifting left essentially comes down to. Now, not just thinking about security, but having controls and tools and so on and so forth in place. They're going to help with the ultimate security of the application when it's time to go live. There's clearly many other tools that you can implement, but a CSPM is probably one of the more important ones to begin with. Now, here is a nice little chart that shows some statistics. Citation is definitely needed for this, but if you're doing a manual audit, you may be finding some percentage of vulnerabilities. You go ahead and deploy a CSPM in Q2 of 2026, perhaps, and all of a sudden you're coming back with a lot less. You're remediating a lot more vulnerabilities. Up to 75% of vulnerabilities are identified and perhaps remediated. You start automating your solution, your policy, your program, your whatever it is, your workflows with a CSPMS, and the CSPM finds a finding, and then you've automated a solution to fix that finding, and now you have a very high reduction of vulnerabilities. So you're mediating a very high rate of vulnerabilities. Now, there's pros and cons to this type of approach where you're automating, you've built a tool or you've implemented a tool and you built in a process that's going to parse the output of that tool and fix findings automatically. There's risk associated with that, as in if you screw something up, you could fail a lot faster or break things even more than they're broken right now. So what you want to do is ideally have a non-prod environment where you can actually test out the automation of this type of solution, where you have a tool, a CSPM or some other tool like that. You parse those findings, and then you say, hey, based on this, we're going to update our CloudFormation templates. We're going to update Terraform. And when we go to deploy to all of our different cloud providers, we're going to have all these remediations already baked in to the new version of our Terraform code, for example, and test it out in non-prod first, is what I'm saying. Next strategy here, use cloud native tools. Each one of our CSPs has a number of built-in tools that could be leveraged for things like threat detection or compliance or things like having a SIM or whatever it is, dealing with your identity and access management and finding flaws, or of course, even the CSPMs that have been purchased recently by, in this case, GCP. The point is that you have tools at your fingertips you could be leveraging right now. Now, the caveat right off the bat, not for free. Some of these tools that fall into the category of useful are free and open source, usually at the endpoint layer, not always. Some web application tools are free. Some scanning tools are free. And of course, you're writing code to fix a flaw is also to some extent free. It doesn't cost money to buy a tool. But a lot of the other tools we're going to talk about, or that I mentioned, or you saw on the last slide, I should say, like guard duty and config and having a Sentinel, for example, or whatever it happens to be, these typically cost money. And that, the bigger the environment is, the more they're going to cost. But I wouldn't say that needs to be a barrier for you. It just needs to be a part of the conversation so you understand that there is some trade-off here with what value you get out of having some of these tools implemented and how much it's going to cost. Now, the benefit, once again, the why are we using cloud native tools is because they're specifically built to perform a function and they work quite well. The function of detecting threats, the function of identifying vulnerabilities and misconfigurations inside of each one of your CSPs. And that's really a huge piece here. Like if you look at the Venn diagram, if you will, of why cloud breaches occur to begin with, you have three main categories. The first one is human error. The second one is misconfigurations. And the third category is IM, like humans misconfiguring IM, kind of all over the apps a little bit. But the point here is that these native tools in each one of our CSPs have the capability to ascertain the current level of configuration. Like not current level, but the current state of configuration. How have you configured your security groups? How have you configured your whatever it happens to be, your web application firewall? Or have you misconfigured it? Are there other policies you could be putting into place to enhance the security posture of your organization? The answer is who knows? The answer is a tool will tell you if you've misconfigured something. And then from there, you have the ability to then take action. All right. And that's kind of the next main step here. You're going to have tools, you're going to have processes, you're going to have so on and so forth. But using the information that you've obtained from these tools to then take action and make useful security-centric changes in your environment is the next main thing you need to focus in on. The last strategy I want to talk about here is secure data and APIs. Classify sensitive data. This speaks to, in my opinion, some level of maturity. As in, you're not getting to the point where you're classifying data, usually, depending on the organization and priorities, until you've already gone through a lot of other steps. The first one would be like, asset inventory and software inventory and having endpoint controls and so on and so forth. But at some point, you get to the point where you have to classify data and say, this storage container contains a bunch of sensitive information, or this is all intermingled. We have a SharePoint, and within SharePoint, we have a bunch of customer records, we have a bunch of employee information, and we have a bunch of publicly available information. Okay, should it all be in the same location? And how are you controlling access to that data? And I can tell you firsthand, I worked in organizations over the years where that's exactly what it was. We had SharePoint, log into SharePoint, I'm just a regular employee, no admin access, and I start searching SharePoint for whatever, and I come back with, oh, here's 250,000 records of PII. Social security numbers, first name, last name, date of birth, address, phone number for customers. It's like, why is this in SharePoint? Why do I have access to it? Does everybody have access to this? I don't need this. It's not part of my job. That's a real thing. Hunting for this data, then classifying it, understanding where it may reside at. I'm talking could be virtual hard drive, it could be in a cloud storage container, it could be S3 bucket, for example. You could find data in a container, and wherever these data reside at is where you want to be focused your efforts to then classify it accordingly. Classify it, is it sensitive? Is this publicly available? Is it something in between, right? And then from there, putting controls in place to control access. And this goes down to encryption at rest, using customer managed keys or CSP managed keys, whatever the case happens to be. You have choices here, but you have to start somewhere, and that's identifying and classifying your data. Other things you need to be focused on here is the inventory, API inventory. These shadow APIs that exist, but you're not aware of. And this was it's actually made headlines. I'm not going to go into depth with that because I don't have any time really to go off on a tangent, but what integrations you may have with third-party service providers is probably the best way to say that. Data security posture management, it's not just CSPMs, you have DSPMs. And what these tools can help you do is exactly what I just talked about a moment ago. Like, where does your sensitive information reside at? Can they find them? And this harkens back to the days where on-prem, we'd be looking at tools like, I can't think of the name right now, unfortunately. I don't know. Tool that looks for information that gets sent out of the organization that shouldn't be sent out. DLP. Thank you, me. Data leakage, data loss prevention tools. Same concept here inside our CSPs, where they're looking through all the information that we have and then understanding what it is and then helping us classify that data in an automated fashion, ideally. And then having some type of policy enforcement that goes back to who can access the information, what's the need for this to be exposed, do we need to be holding on to it, how long do we retain this for, all those type of conversations. All right. And it's a big deal. The last thing, actually, the last kind of bullet point here is monitoring for the API usage. This is where, when I say API usage, I'm referring to there are API calls that are reading, that result in the reading of data inside of our cloud storage container, bucket, whatever it happens to be. All right, is that normal or is that abnormal? The answer is it depends. All right, there's a function, an application, a service, a whatever that's actively reading that content inside of that storage environment, and it happens every single day. Okay, that's normal. But if all of a sudden there is a spike in read access, as in someone's reading sensitive information from an S3 bucket, and that's not a normal thing to have occur, that's where we would be monitoring for API usage and behavioral anomalies. As in, the attacker, the employee, the whomever, they didn't fail to authenticate and fail to authorize the request to this S3 bucket. They successfully read data from a bucket that they shouldn't have probably had access to do in the first place. And maybe they had never done it before. Maybe this is just like a new thing that they came across, or they got suspicious, or whatever it happens to be. They got curious and they came across something sensitive, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, we have a leak. This user, this group of users doesn't need to have access to this sensitive data. But you're not going to know that until you have some type of behavior analytics in place, or in this case, behavior anomaly detection in place. And it goes back to, once again, the very, very first topic we talked about, which was the unified visibility. Having logs, aggregating those logs, and then having a SIM to help you identify when something suspicious like that is potentially occurring. All right, lots and lots of topics here, lots of fun stuff to talk about. Key takeaways that are probably worth noting is that you have to really think of a strategy, right? It's not buying one tool or a set of tools and saying, okay, that's our strategy is to buy a tool. Like, no, you need to really be thinking in depth about what the strategy is going to be to get the information that you need to put it all together to figure out how are you going to effectively change the security posture of your organization. When I say that, I'm referring to all the stuff we talked about. None of this is easy. Whether it's identity access management and having a centralized identity provider, moving to that type of solution, or whether it's even data classification or using a CSPM. These are tools, these are ideas, these are how are you going to do it? That's where the rubber meets the road. This is where it gets more challenging. So thinking through, here's how we can accomplish these tasks. Then, of course, the automation component. All right, getting to the point where you can automate a large portion of what it is you're trying to accomplish. And I see and hear kind of some different thoughts on this idea of automation. Like, if I automate what I do on a daily basis, doesn't mean I don't have a job anymore. The answer is potentially not the right answer, right? But I'm not gonna lie to you. In my experience, I'll just tell you what I've done in my career. I tried to, and it sounds weird, but I would actively try to automate myself out of a job, like literally. Here's a task that I'm doing. This task is boring. It's repetitive. It's not adding value. And you got to think about that. What task would this be? Oh, I'm looking at alerts, and these alerts are useless. Or I'm changing permissions, or I'm hardening a server as part of a secure build process. Okay, I'm doing the same thing over and over and over. Yeah, I can write a bash script or some PowerShell that's going to do the exact same thing, or I can leverage the APIs inside of each one of my CSPs to do these things for me. Why is the company going to keep on paying me to do this once they realize that it can be automated? So I beat the company to the punch. I was like, I'm going to automate this myself, and that freed me up to work on cooler, more advanced things. The next tool, the next implementation of a tool, the next whatever it was. So I would actively try to automate myself out of a job. It's weird to say it like that, but that's how I found success in my career path. The last thing I'll mention here is defense in depth. And this is not, I wouldn't say it's a buzzword. This is a real thing. It's a real strategy. It's a real idea that you need to be thinking about. What it actually consists of is just the reality that it's not like there's one thing we can do that's going to solve all of our problems. All right, there's no panacea, there's no tool, there's no one thing that, okay, we implemented this, we bought this, we whatever, and now we're good to go. Like, no, there's so much depth and complexity and moving parts to a bigger company where it's extremely challenging to really have a tight grip on security because there are so many different ways an adversary potentially gain access. You think about something as simple as email. I'm going to send you a spear phishing campaign. Yeah, that still works. Oh, well, we're going to implement zero trust, and we're going to implement two-factor authentication, and we're going to enforce. Yeah, okay, cool, great. Now someone's launching an injection attack against your application. Oh, that has nothing to do at all with phishing and social engineering. That has to do with secure code. It has to do with application layer controls, has to do with endpoint controls, has to do with network layer controls, if I didn't say that already, and actually having a strategy in place to block those attacks or to educate developers on how to write secure code. Okay, cool. How about redundancy? We have an outage because everything is running in US East 1. Yeah. Those of you who went through that 3 weeks-ish ago, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who watch this later, maybe Google that. October 2025 AWS outage. I've talked a lot. Here's the recommend next steps. See where you're at. Do an audit. If you don't have money, you don't have budget, that's cool. You can talk to a VAR. That's a value-added reseller. And you can do a demo. You can do a demo of a CSPM or something and see what that visibility would end up looking like for you. Same thing with IAM. You can hire a third-party company if you don't have the internal or in-house expertise. You can do all these different things. And I highly recommend that you do. As far as where we take this conversation to next, there's things you can tangibly do right now that are going to potentially result in, enhanced security. There's also, of course, upcoming Sec 502 training sessions. SAN Sec 502, very awesome course. I'd highly recommend. I'm biased, of course, but it's very high quality content, and it's going to help you with a lot of the things we talked about. Like we have like an hour to talk about this. Well, imagine going into significant depth over 5 days. I'm not here to sell you on it, but it's worth mentioning. With that being said, the last thing I'll say is look at this from an enterprise perspective. Assume you get breached. do an instant response tabletop exercise. If you're not familiar with that, Google it. Instant response tabletop exercise. I know a company that can help you out with that. Go through and assume a breach. Not just for, okay, there's an outage. Okay, that's not even fun. Let's do a cybersecurity breach where there's an incident that results in identity theft or ransomware or something like that, where it's intricate, it's detailed, it hones in on what you already know you have deficiencies in. And that way you bring those deficiencies to light and say, we have very little visibility into this. And because of the lack of visibility, we didn't know we were being attacked over the last 6 months. And the attackers were eventually successful. And we didn't know they were successful until so on and so forth, right? Go through an assumed breach that just goes through a hypothetical situation of how a breach could occur given what you know. I also will briefly mention this because I think it's critically important. You as a security professional, you're there to enable the business, not stop, not block things, not be the voices like, no, we can't do that. Like, how can the business continue to make money and continue to do what it does with security at the forefront? And if it was easy, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about this. We wouldn't have a job. It's not easy. It's extremely difficult to do. But you want to do this and in a fashion that's helping move the business forward. Period. You can read the rest for yourself. I've talked enough. If you have questions, reach out. Please don't hesitate to stay in touch. I want to thank everyone for being here and spending your time listening to me talk. Hopefully you got some value out of this and have some ideas you can take back to your place of business and some solutions you can put into place. Thank you so much.